The boy did not know why the doorway was so quiet that morning. No one stopped him as he rose from his sleeping mat. No one offered bread soaked in watered wine. The house was not silent from sleep, but from waiting, the kind of stillness that comes before something breaks. And when the men arrived, bronze fittings clinking against leather straps, he was not asked if he was ready. At 7, he did not know what it meant to be taken by the state. He had no words for ownership, obligation, or duty. He only knew the hand that reached for him was not his mother's, larger, rougher, smelling of olive oil and iron from the gymnasium where citizens exercised before dawn. There was no ritual, no declaration, no chance to say goodbye. She had been warned the night before. Any sign of resistance would bring shame to their family name. She watched as her son walked out, not to school, not to war, but to something else entirely, a place that would raise him without ever holding him. In Sparta, the bond between mother and child was tolerated only as a phase. Love was not forbidden, just discarded when no longer useful. The city did not need affection, it needed obedience, and the boy was no longer hers, he was theirs. The state did not see this transfer as theft, it was the beginning of becoming. The training regime, known as the Agoge, was not described as punishment or prison. It was a system that produced order, strength, and survival. To achieve this, the first requirement was absence, of family, of comfort, of softness. The others were already waiting, other boys, other sons. None of them spoke. Their mothers were not coming back, their names would not be called out again at home. They belonged now to a different mouth, a different voice, the voice of instruction, of demand. Sparta did not believe in gradual change, it believed in severance. To teach loyalty to the state, it first erased every other loyalty. The boy's memory of his mother would remain, but it would no longer be a comfort, it would be a test. When he hungered for safety, he would be watched. When he longed for warmth, he would be denied. The boy did not run. There was nowhere to run to. The world outside the system no longer existed. Even the memory of his mother began to shift, not because she disappeared, but because the system ensured that she had no role left to play. If you're fascinated by history's most disturbing training methods, subscribe for more stories of how ancient civilizations forged their future soldiers. In the Agoge, there were no lullabies sung before sleep, no stories told to chase away fears in the darkness. The boys of Sparta did not grow up in any recognizable sense. They were honed like bronze blades against a whetstone until every soft edge had been ground away. The Agoge did not waste time with affection or comfort. From the moment they entered the stone barracks, their bodies became objects to train, and their minds became targets to strip of everything that made them individual. Their names were used less and less as the months passed, replaced by group designations, rank numbers, functional categories. Individuality served no purpose in the machine they were being fed into. Comparison replaced identity, competition replaced kinship, and the bonds that might have formed between boys their age were systematically severed before they could take root. Hunger arrived early each morning and stayed with them until they collapsed on their reed mats each night. The meals were deliberately sparse, calculated not to starve them but to sharpen them like wolves. They were encouraged to steal food from the kitchens and beaten savagely when caught. Not for the moral failing of theft, but for the tactical failure to conceal it properly. Deception was a skill to be mastered. Detection was weakness to be eliminated. Pain became their most reliable instructor, arriving with the regularity of sunrise. The whippings were not personal vendettas or expressions of anger. They were scheduled events, as routine as weapons practice or running drills. The boys learned to absorb punishment without reaction. Flinching revealed softness that required correction. Bruises proved readiness for the next level of training. Even sleep offered no escape from the systematic stripping away of comfort. Their beds consisted of reeds torn from riverbanks, deliberately uncomfortable to prevent the luxury of deep rest. Cold seeped up from stone floors and down from mountain air, and if a boy shivered through the night, he was not offered warmth, but shame for his body's weakness. The instructors created an environment where no one could claim exemption from suffering because everyone endured it equally. Silence became their only defense, but not the silence of mere obedience. This was the silence of self-erasure. Pain had to be masked behind expressionless faces. Fear buried so deep it couldn't surface even in dreams, and any hint of joy flattened before it could be detected and punished. These emotions weren't forbidden. They simply had no value in the world the boys now inhabited. Older boys were systematically encouraged to dominate younger ones, not through arbitrary cruelty, but to teach dominance as a necessary language. The younger boys internalized this hierarchy so completely that when they aged into positions of power, they passed the pattern forward without conscious reflection. Violence reproducing itself not through memory, but through embedded instinct. When the instructors struck them, they offered no explanations for the blows. When punishments arrived, they came unaccompanied by reasons or justifications. Causality between action and consequence was deliberately obscured because the system didn't aim to produce understanding. It aimed to create reflexive obedience that operated below the level of conscious thought. By the time the boy turned 12, his body had learned to starve quietly, bleed discreetly, sleep in numbing cold, and speak only when directly commanded. He no longer sought protection, because he had learned it was never coming. He no longer cried, not because the tears had run dry, but because the impulse to shed them had been surgically removed from his emotional repertoire. Some boys broke under this systematic pressure and were discarded with clinical indifference. The system didn't punish failure, it simply moved forward without the broken pieces, focusing its attention on those who proved capable of withstanding the transformation. By the time he reached the edge of adolescence, he didn't wonder where his childhood had gone because he had never been given one to lose. What replaced it was a structure so complete and relentless that it required no explanation or justification. It simply overwrote whatever had been there before, quietly, efficiently, and permanently. There was no announcement echoing through the stone barracks, no ceremony to mark what everyone understood was coming. The boy had reached 16 winters, his body scarred from years of training. The boy had reached the age when something was expected of him, but nothing was said. The absence of words was not a mistake. It was the most deliberate part of a design that had been perfected over generations. By now, he had learned to read silence the way hunters read animal tracks in mountain dust. In Sparta, silence carried more weight than bronze-backed laws or marble-carved decrees. It was not emptiness waiting to be filled with explanation. It was pressure, dense and suffocating. He knew the stories because every boy did. A Spartan did not become a man simply by surviving 17 winters in the Agoge. He became one by disappearing into the harsh countryside beyond the olive groves, with an iron blade hidden beneath his cloak, and returning with no questions left to ask, no innocence left to lose. This was the Krypteia, a ritual everyone understood without explanation. It had no official designation in the city's legal codes, no date marked on bronze calendars. It was not training like their daily weapons practice, not battle like the campaigns against Messenia. It was transformation disguised as tradition, a test that confirmed the system had succeeded in its fundamental purpose. He was not told which helot to kill, which settlement to visit, or what criteria to use for selection. The target was never chosen through political calculation or personal grievance. It can be anyone. No one told him what specific actions to take, but everyone knew what consequences would follow if he failed to act. There would be no official punishment recorded in any document, only exclusion from the brotherhood he had bled to join, only failure that would shame his family name for generations. The Krypteia served a purpose deeper than testing survival skills in the wilderness, measuring instead whether transformation had occurred at the level of instinct. The true mark of Spartan discipline was not mechanical obedience to external authority. It was the capacity to act without instruction, because the system had already spoken through blood and bone and reflex. So the boy prepared with methodical precision, guided by neither excitement nor fear, but by mechanical certainty. He took the iron blade he was permitted and wrapped it carefully in wool cloth to muffle any sound it might make against his ribs. He left the barracks carrying no supplies beyond what he could steal, no maps beyond what he had memorized during training expeditions, no companions beyond the shadows that would hide his approach. The wilderness posed no real challenge to someone trained since childhood to survive on stolen scraps and rainwater collected in cupped palms. It was the killing itself, and the boy, now perfectly moulded to serve the city's needs, would claim nothing. The killing would become part of him the way breathing was part of him. Silent, automatic, essential. He gathered no provisions, looked back toward no familiar faces, and made no preparations beyond those already built into his bones through years of calculated hunger and violence. He left not because desire drove him forward, or because legal obligation compelled him, but because there was no version of himself remaining that could choose differently. The boy who might have hesitated had been killed years ago, so gradually and quietly that no one had noticed his death. 3 days after leaving the city, he had found this position beneath the brush. He had spent the day unmoving, his skin pressed against damp earth while he listened to wind shift through thorns and the scrape of distant sandals over gravel. His cloak was stiff from sweat and dust that had accumulated during the long hours of waiting. Insects moved freely across his arms and face, but he did not brush them away. His legs had long gone numb beneath him, but he did not shift position because the training had taught him to wait without questioning time or discomfort. The rules governing the Krypteia were never written on bronze tablets or carved into stone, but they were understood by every boy who undertook this final trial. A boy on Krypteia must not be seen. He had seen what happened when one of them broke that rule. At dusk he had glimpsed another boy moving along the exposed ridge above the barley fields. Too fast, too careless, silhouetted against the dying light like a target begging to be seen. The helots noticed him immediately. 3 men dropped their tools and gave chase across the rocky slope. The boy tried to run, but loose stones shifted beneath his sandals and sent him tumbling down the hillside. They reached him before he could untangle himself from the thorn bushes, before his hand could find the knife hidden beneath his cloak. What followed was not a clean death. By morning, there was only evidence of violence scattered across the limestone, dark stains, broken branches, a single sandal with its leather strap torn completely through. No one went to search for his body or to bring him back for proper burial. No one spoke his name during the evening meal or offered prayers for his soul. In Sparta, those who failed to transform were treated as if they had never existed. The day passed in perfect silence except for the steady heartbeat that pounded in his ear as he maintained his position. His fingers remained curled around the knife's hilt where it lay hidden beneath his cloak. He had oiled the metal carefully the night before, not for any ceremonial purpose, but to ensure it would make no sound when drawn. When the sun finally died behind the western ridge and darkness began to claim the valley, he allowed himself to move with careful deliberation. He crawled slowly until the soft earth gave way to flat rock, until the deep shadows cast by ancient olive trees masked the shape of his body completely. Every movement was calculated to produce no sound, because sound would mean betrayal of his position and certain death. The helot settlement lay just beyond a dry stream bed that separated their humble dwellings from the wild country where he had spent the day in hiding. There were no armed guards patrolling the perimeter, no walls built for defense against attack, just low fires burning outside simple huts and the quiet movements of people preparing for sleep. He circled the small settlement once and then twice, waiting for sounds that would reveal the rhythm of their evening routine, watching for moments when individuals might be exposed and vulnerable. Then he saw his target, a man of middle age, neither young enough to be reckless nor old enough to be easily dismissed. The helot was crouched beside a dying fire pit, using a bronze knife to carve bark from a thick branch, his head bowed in concentration over his work. The boy waited and watched while he measured the distance he would need to cover, calculating angles of approach that would minimize his chances of detection. He crossed the final space between hiding place and target, like wind slipping silently between standing stones. The blade emerged from beneath his cloak without catching on fabric or reflecting firelight. The helot began to turn just as the iron point entered the soft flesh of his neck. There was a sound. Not a scream that might alert others, but simply breath cut short and pushed through clenched teeth in a moment of confused surprise. The man's hand shot upward instinctively and caught the boy's wrist. Then the fingers slipped away as strength left them, and his eyes lost focus before they could form any expression of plea. The boy withdrew the blade without urgency or haste, watching blood pool behind the man's shoulder, while steam rose faintly in the cold night air. He didn't stay to observe the body or to confirm that death was complete. That was not part of the ritual that had brought him here. Instead, he turned away and retraced his careful steps back toward the wild country, and no one followed him into the darkness. By dawn, the dust on his sandals was dry again as he stepped into the edge of the barracks compound, where he had lived for most of his remembered life. No trumpet sounded to announce his return, No formal greeting waited to acknowledge his accomplishment. One older boy simply shifted slightly to allow him space in the circle, gathered near the morning fire, and that small gesture was sufficient recognition. Another boy returned from his own trial, younger and thinner than the rest, his eyes wide with the fatigue that comes from a sleepless night spent in terror. There was dirt on his face, and thorns caught in his hair, but there was no blood on his hands or beneath his fingernails. He stood at the edge of the group, waiting for the same space to be offered to him that had been given to others. No one moved to make room for him. One boy spat deliberately on the ground near his feet, not directly at him, but close enough to clarify the meaning of the gesture. There was no formal punishment announced for his failure, no official dismissal from the brotherhood he had sought to join. But the silence that surrounded him had weight and pressure that did not press downward but pushed outward, creating an invisible barrier between him and those who had proven themselves worthy. Sparta did not punish failure with whips or chains, but with something far more effective, complete irrelevance to the community that mattered. When the instructors passed by during their morning inspection, they gave no verbal acknowledgement of what had occurred during the night, offered no comments about success or failure. But when their eyes fell upon the boy who had killed, their gaze did not simply pass over him, but lingered for just a moment longer than necessary, and that subtle difference was sufficient recognition. The Krypteia was never mentioned in official documents, never debated in the assembly, never questioned in the courts. Yet it was as fundamental to Spartan society as the laws carved into bronze tablets or the religious festivals that marked each season. Citizens planned their lives around it, organized their calendar by it, and measured their sons' progress toward manhood through it. When boys disappeared into the countryside for days or weeks at a time, their absence was noted but never discussed. When they returned with changes that could not be hidden, a new steadiness in their gaze, a different quality to their silence, blood beneath fingernails that took days to clean completely, these transformations were welcomed as evidence that the system continued to function exactly as their ancestors had designed it. The Helot population lived with the knowledge that death could come at any moment, from any direction, without warning or reason. They developed elaborate strategies for survival, travelling in groups during dangerous seasons, avoiding isolated areas when young Spartans were known to be abroad, teaching their children to recognise the signs that preceded a culling. This constant terror was not an unfortunate side effect of Spartan policy. It was the intended result. Fear was a tool, deliberately crafted and systematically deployed to maintain order among a population that outnumbered their masters by nearly 10-1. The occasional disappearance of Helots served multiple purposes. It provided training for young Spartans, eliminated potential troublemakers, and reminded the surviving population that their lives existed entirely at the discretion of their betters. Religious leaders blessed this arrangement through careful interpretation of divine will. The gods, they explained, had ordained a natural hierarchy that placed Spartans above Helots, just as humans stood above animals. To question this order was to question divine wisdom. To resist it was to invite the gods' wrath upon the entire community. Murder was reframed as sacred duty, violence transformed into religious observance. Legal scholars provided additional justification through constitutional interpretation. The annual declaration of war against the Helots created a permanent state of conflict that made killing not only permissible but patriotic. Young men who took Helot lives were not committing murder, they were defending their homeland against a perpetual enemy. The law had been carefully constructed to provide legal cover for systematic atrocity. Economic interests aligned perfectly with moral rationalization. Helot labor generated the wealth that funded Spartan military superiority, subsidized citizen leisure, and maintained the lifestyle that made their civilization the envy of the Greek world. Any disruption to this system would have threatened not just individual prosperity, but the foundations of Spartan power. The cost of maintaining order was measured in Helot blood, and Spartan society had decided that price was acceptable. The broader Greek world knew what happened in Laconia but chose to look away. Sparta's military strength made them valuable allies and dangerous enemies. Other city-states needed Spartan warriors to defend against Persian invasions, to settle territorial disputes, to maintain the balance of power that kept any single polis from dominating the others. Knowledge of Spartan brutality was suppressed not from ignorance, but from calculated self-interest. This conspiracy of silence extended across generations, creating a civilization that functioned smoothly on foundations of deliberate cruelty, while maintaining the fiction that it represented the highest achievements of human culture. Children grew into adults who perpetuated systems they had inherited without examination. Adults became elders who passed those systems to the next generation with minor refinements, but no fundamental changes. The machine reproduced itself with mechanical precision, creating new killers to replace the old ones, training new victims to accept their fate, and ensuring that each generation found the arrangement as natural and necessary as their predecessors had. What began as policy became custom. What started as expedience transformed into sacred tradition, and what should have been recognized as atrocity was celebrated as the source of Spartan greatness. The helots who died in darkness left behind families who mourned in silence, children who learned to expect no justice, and communities that adapted to constant threat as a normal condition of existence. Their names were never recorded, their deaths never investigated, their absence never officially acknowledged. They existed in Spartan society only as labor to be exploited and lives to be taken when exploitation alone proved insufficient. This was not the result of individual evil or temporary madness. It was the deliberate choice of an entire civilization that had decided some people could be sacrificed to preserve the privileges of others. Generation after generation of Spartans made this choice, refined this system, and passed it on to their children as their most valuable inheritance. The question that haunts history is not how such a system could emerge, but how it could persist for centuries among people who considered themselves civilized, moral, and blessed by the gods. The answer lies not in the unique barbarism of ancient Sparta, but in the universal human capacity to rationalize atrocity when it serves our interests, and to ignore suffering when acknowledging it would require sacrifice. What kind of society requires its children to commit murder in order to belong? The same kind that builds temples to justice while practicing systematic oppression, that celebrates honor while rewarding cruelty, and that calls itself civilized while engineering the deliberate destruction of human dignity. The same kind, in other words, that still exists today.